Everywhere today, we hear of a crisis of the humanities, departments closing, enrollment declining, a generation told that literature, philosophy, and art no longer matter. We must trade beauty and reflection for efficiency and code. But this crisis, this apparent death of the humanistic spirit, is not new. It has accompanied every technological revolution, not only in our modern time, but I'm willing to venture into the ancient times as well. And one of the examples that I have in mind is specifically from Plato's Phaedrus, when Socrates is having a discussion about the nature of writing, and he gives the story of the pharaoh and one of the gods having a discussion of the dangers of writing, making human beings' memory disappear. Ultimately, Socrates gives this myth to say that the true writing is one that happens upon the soul. The question is, can this still happen today? When the printing press appeared, thinkers feared the end of memory. When the camera was invented, painters worried that art itself might vanish. And when machines have begun to think, to speak, to calculate, and to predict, the question of what it means to think has now become uncertain. What if this crisis isn't simply about funding or relevance, but about reality itself? What if the human being is no longer the measure of truth, but one model among others? We are simulated, we are analyzed, but the question is, can we be replaced? This is the question that Jean Baudrillard saw coming, at least in my view. A question not of the humanities versus technology, but of humanity versus its own image. Because Baudrillard believed that the age of meaning was giving way to the age of model, the final product of this transformation could potentially be us. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Popular Philosophy. And in this episode, we're continuing and wrapping up this theme of postmodernity and introducing our final figure. Do not worry if you enjoyed this. I plan in the near future doing more in-depth analysis of some of these figures and text. So let's move into the next part 2, when big stories have faded and the model has taken over. We are living in the aftermath of great stories. The narratives of progress, reason, and emancipation, which I have seemingly beat to death in this series, have now come to seem as collapsed. After those narratives have ended, Lyotard would teach us what followed was not silence, but a world of ever-evolving images, signs, and models. Enter Jean Baudrillard, born in 1929 in Reims, France, a sociologist turned philosopher who witnessed not only the collapse of modernity, but the arrival of something else. A realm where representation no longer mirrors reality, but it replaces it. Baudrillard's early life was marked by post-war disillusionment. He began as a German literature scholar before turning to sociology. He was influenced by Marx and semiotics. But by the 1970s, which is a trend and a pattern that I found, and I think it could correspond with the May 68 movements in France, Baudrillard no longer believed that reason and revolution could redeem the world, only that the world had become a network of signs without substance. What happens when we're living in this condition? This brings us to the third part, from grand narratives to hyperreality. For Lyotard, the end of modernity's grand narratives could leave us fragmented. Lyotard asked, what comes after meaning itself collapses? His answer? Simulation. In his famous 1981 work, Simulacra and Simulation, he writes, the simulacrum is never what conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. This begins his famous meditation on a fable of an empire that made a perfect map. For Baudrillard, our world is that map, a copy with no original. He later writes in the same text, simulation is no longer of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is a generation by models of real without origin or reality, what he calls a hyperreal. Disneyland, he wrote, exists not to represent fantasy, but to disguise that everything outside of it is just as artificial. He writes, Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real. This cues our next discussion, the nature of artificial intelligence and the new simulacrum. If hyperreality was born in the age of television, it reaches maturity in the age of AI. AI does not imitate thought, it performs it. It simulates consciousness, emotion, and reason, generating patterns so convincing that we mistake it for a mind. In Baudrillard's language, AI is the simulacrum of intelligence, a model of a real without origin. It learns from us, but in learning, it produces a second-order humanity. It is predictive, statistical, and infinitely repeatable. The map now not only precedes the territory, it begins to withdraw it in real time. In Baudrillard's work from 1990, The Transparency of Evil, he writes, the virtual is not opposed to the real, it absorbs it. And the more faithfully it imitates, the more it annihilates it. AI is the absorption made flesh, the mirror that predicts our reflection until it no longer needs us. We are watching the model overtake the human and the human become the model. So part 5, existence after simulation. Yet Baudrillard's work is not pure despair, as many of the figures that I've tried to highlight are in agreement with this. He understood that the crisis of meaning is also a creative turning. When the world becomes a simulation, our task is to rediscover awareness, to see the models for what they are, and to live through them without mistaking them for life itself. In his text, Ecstasy of Communication, in 1988, he would write, we live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning. The humanities, in this sense, are not dying. They are becoming the last refuge of meaning. At least this is what I believe. Philosophy, art, and literature remain the spaces where we remember that thought is not an algorithm, that the self is not a model, and that language is more than data. Baudrillard died in 2007 in Paris, before the rise of deep learning. But the world that he described, saturated with images, simulations, and copies of consciousness, is one that we now inhabit. So perhaps the crisis of the humanities is not a decline, but a revelation. That the age of AI, the task of thought, is to keep being human. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Popular Philosophy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to bringing you more content in the near future.